If you've ever watched people smile to your face while quietly tearing you down in front of others, this story is going to make your stomach twist. Because there's a special kind of cruelty in turning a moment of joy into a stage for humiliation. The day of my wedding was supposed to be about love, new beginnings, and choosing happiness after a long season of doubt. Instead, it became the day my own family mocked my new husband in front of everyone, and learned too late that the man they thought they had figured out was nothing like the story they had told themselves. Growing up in a family that measured worth by status felt like learning a language I never fully believed in, but was expected to speak fluently. The rules weren't written down, but they were everywhere. The way people were introduced at gatherings always included their job title before their name. The way achievements were discussed carried more enthusiasm than kindness. Success was framed as something you could display, something that could be admired from across a room. Quiet effort didn't count for much unless it came with visible rewards. From an early age, I learned that approval in my family came with conditions attached to how impressive you appeared to others. At family events, conversations often circled around promotions, investments, new homes, and who had been invited to which exclusive gatherings. Compliments were given in ways that felt more like evaluations, as if each person's life were being scored against an invisible rubric. If someone's choices didn't fit neatly into that rubric, they were discussed with a polite kind of pity. It wasn't openly cruel. It was the softer cruelty of condescension, of treating someone's path as a lesser version of what life should look like. Over time, that tone seeped into how I learned to view my own choices. I absorbed those values without fully agreeing with them. I learned how to present myself in ways that would earn nods of approval. I became aware of which details of my life would be celebrated, and which would be quietly dismissed. When I made choices that aligned with their expectations, I was praised for being sensible, for making smart moves, for choosing stability. When I drifted from that path, the praise became cautious, wrapped in concern that sounded like support, but felt like disappointment. The message was subtle but persistent. Your worth is easier to recognize when it looks impressive from the outside. That conditioning shaped how I navigated relationships. I found myself drawn, at least initially, to people who fit the family's idea of success, even when those relationships didn't nourish me in deeper ways. There was a comfort in knowing that my choices would be validated by the people who mattered to me. That comfort came at a cost. It meant I sometimes prioritized approval over alignment with my own values. I learned to question my instincts when they pointed me toward things that didn't come with external markers of success. The pressure to conform didn't always feel oppressive, because it was wrapped in a narrative of wanting the best for me. My family believed, genuinely, that their standards protected me from settling for less. They equated ambition with worthiness and visibility with value. The problem was that this framework left little room for forms of fulfillment that couldn't be easily measured or displayed. Kindness, integrity, and quiet purpose didn't fit neatly into their definition of success, because they didn't come with obvious proof points. Living within that value system taught me to perform success rather than to question what success meant to me. I learned how to curate stories about my life that highlighted the parts others would admire. I downplayed aspects of myself that didn't fit the image I was expected to maintain. Over time, that performance created a subtle disconnect between who I was and who I presented myself as. The disconnect wasn't dramatic. It showed up in small hesitations, in the way I filtered my enthusiasm for things that didn't align with the family's ideals, in the way I learned to speak about my own life in terms that would be received well. The most difficult part of growing up in that environment was how easily judgment could masquerade as concern. When someone in the family chose a path that didn't align with the status-driven framework, the response was often framed as worry about their future. But that worry carried an undercurrent of comparison, a suggestion that their choices were less respectable, because they didn't signal success in the expected ways. Witnessing that dynamic taught me to be cautious about revealing parts of myself that might be deemed unimpressive. I learned to protect those parts by keeping them quiet. As I got older, I began to notice how this way of measuring worth affected the emotional tone of our relationships. Conversations felt transactional, focused on what could be displayed rather than on how people were actually doing. Achievements were celebrated more loudly than resilience. Appearances were valued over authenticity. That realization created a growing tension inside me between the values I had been taught and the values I was beginning to form for myself. I started to question why certain qualities were elevated while others were treated as secondary, and what it would mean to choose a life that felt meaningful even if it didn't look impressive to the people who had shaped my early understanding of success. Loving a quiet man in a loud, judgmental room felt like standing still while the air around us buzzed with opinions that never quite settled. From the moment Aaron stepped into my family's orbit, I could sense the mismatch between who he was and what they expected. He didn't announce himself. He didn't try to win anyone over with stories of achievement, or with displays of confidence designed to impress. He listened. He noticed details. He carried himself with a calm that didn't need validation. In rooms where presence was often measured by how loudly you could assert yourself, his quietness was interpreted as absence. At first, I hoped they would grow curious about him in the way I had. I imagined them noticing how thoughtful he was, how he asked questions that showed he was paying attention rather than performing interest. I thought they would appreciate the way he treated people with the same respect regardless of their status. But curiosity requires a willingness to suspend judgment, and my family wasn't practiced in that. Their assessments came quickly, shaped by a framework that equated worth with visibility. Aaron didn't fit into that framework, so they filled the gap with assumptions. Those assumptions showed up in the questions they asked. What does he do, exactly? Does he have plans to move up? Is this just a phase for you? The tone wasn't openly hostile, but it carried an undercurrent of evaluation. Each question felt like a way of measuring him against a standard he hadn't chosen to compete within. Watching that dynamic unfold, I felt a familiar tension rise in me. Part of me wanted to defend him immediately, to translate his quiet strengths into language my family would respect. Another part of me resented the idea that he needed to be translated at all. Being with someone who didn't perform for approval highlighted how deeply I had learned to do just that. I noticed my own impulse to explain him in ways that would make him more acceptable to my family, to emphasize aspects of his life that might impress them. Catching that impulse was uncomfortable, because it revealed how much I had internalized their values, even as I questioned them. Loving Aaron became a mirror for the ways I had learned to shape my choices around external judgment. There were moments when the room felt heavy with unspoken comparisons. Relatives would bring up past partners or acquaintances who fit their idea of success, not directly criticizing Aaron, but positioning him in contrast to a version of what they considered better. The comparisons weren't always explicit. They lived in sighs, in raised eyebrows, in comments about how surprising it was that I had chosen someone so understated. Those moments didn't just judge him. They subtly questioned my judgment as well, suggesting that my choice reflected a lowering of standards rather than a shift in values. What made this dynamic difficult was the way it placed me in the middle of two worlds. In one world, I felt deeply seen and respected by a partner who valued presence over performance. In the other, I felt the familiar pressure to justify my choices to people who measured worth by how impressive something looked from the outside. Holding those two realities at once required a kind of emotional steadiness I hadn't fully developed yet. I found myself oscillating between wanting to shield Aaron from their judgments and wanting to shield myself from the discomfort of challenging my family's assumptions. Over time, loving someone who didn't seek approval began to shift something in me. I noticed how often he chose not to engage with subtle disrespect, not out of passivity, but out of a grounded sense of self. He didn't feel the need to correct every misconception, because he wasn't trying to earn a place in their hierarchy. Watching him navigate those spaces with quiet dignity made me question why I had spent so much energy trying to fit into hierarchies that didn't reflect what I valued. His calmness wasn't an absence of strength. It was a different expression. Being in that loud, judgmental room with him highlighted the difference between being seen and being evaluated. My family evaluated him based on how well he fit their criteria for success. I saw him based on how he showed up in relationships, how he treated people when there was nothing to gain, how he moved through the world without needing to announce his worth. That difference in perception created tension, but it also clarified my own values. I began to see that choosing him wasn't about rejecting my family. It was about choosing a way of relating that felt more honest to who I was becoming. The mocking at the reception didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of weeks of subtle judgments that had been building beneath the surface. When people feel entitled to evaluate others, those evaluations eventually find their way into the open, especially in moments when formality gives way to loosened boundaries. Alcohol had a way of dissolving whatever restraint had kept the comments polite. What had once been murmured as concern or curiosity now emerged as jokes and casual remarks that carried the same assumptions, just without the soft wrapping. The first comment landed like a small crack in the air. It wasn't loud enough to stop the room, but it was loud enough for the people closest to hear. A joke about how Aaron looked like he had wandered in from a different world. Laughter followed, the kind that's offered reflexively when someone with social power signals that it's acceptable to laugh. That laughter didn't feel like joy. It felt like agreement disguised as humor. The comment itself wasn't devastating in isolation. It was the familiarity of it that hurt, the recognition that this was simply the family's narrative about him finally being spoken aloud. As more remarks surfaced, the room's energy shifted from celebratory to evaluative. The attention that should have been on the joy of the moment drifted toward assessing and diminishing the person standing beside me. Each comment reinforced the unspoken hierarchy my family lived by, where people were measured against standards they hadn't chosen. Watching that happen in a space that was meant to honor our union felt like a violation, not just of Aaron's dignity, but of the intention of the day itself. The reception, which was supposed to mark a beginning, became a stage for old patterns of judgment to assert themselves. What made the moment especially painful was the casualness with which the comments were delivered. There was no overt malice in the tone, which made it harder to challenge without seeming overly sensitive. The jokes were framed as light-hearted, as if diminishing someone could be excused if it was done with a smile. That casual cruelty is difficult to confront, because it hides behind the social expectation of good humor. Calling it out risks positioning yourself as the one who can't take a joke, even when the joke carries the weight of real disrespect. I could see the impact on Aaron in the smallest shifts of his expression. The tightening of his jaw. The way his eyes flicked briefly toward me, as if checking whether I was okay. He didn't engage with the comments directly. He didn't offer rebuttals or explanations. His choice to remain composed in the face of public judgment was an act of quiet resilience. But resilience doesn't mean the absence of hurt. It means carrying hurt without letting it dictate your response. Watching him do that in front of people who were supposed to be celebrating us together stirred a protective anger in me I hadn't fully anticipated. The mocking also revealed how comfortable my family was with asserting their values in public spaces. There was an assumption that their perspective was the default, that their way of measuring worth was the one everyone else would accept. That assumption gave them permission to speak, as if their judgments were neutral observations rather than reflections of their own biases. Seeing that dynamic play out so openly made it impossible to pretend that these attitudes were just misunderstandings. They were choices, repeated often enough to become normalized. In that moment, I felt the weight of standing between loyalty to my partner and the long history I shared with my family. The instinct to keep the peace tugged at me, the familiar urge to smooth things over rather than disrupt the room. But the room had already been disrupted by the disrespect. Silence in that context wouldn't have preserved harmony. It would have signaled agreement. Even choosing not to escalate the moment felt like a decision with emotional consequences, a choice to protect the day from turning into a confrontation, at the cost of letting the mockery stand unchallenged in the air. The public nature of the mocking made it harder to compartmentalize. Private slights can be processed later, away from the eyes of others. Public slights imprint themselves in a different way, because they involve an audience, a collective witnessing that can deepen the sense of violation. The reception became a mirror reflecting not just how my family saw Aaron, but how comfortable they were revealing that perspective in a space meant to honor our commitment to each other. That reflection lingered with me, reshaping how I understood the dynamics I had been navigating quietly for months. The moment the room shifted was almost imperceptible at first, like the subtle change in pressure before a storm breaks. The questions that followed Aaron's calm explanation weren't loud or dramatic, but they carried a different tone from the mocking that had come before. Curiosity replaced condescension. Interest replaced dismissal. It was unsettling to watch how quickly perception could change once new information entered the space. The man who had just been treated as an object of casual amusement was suddenly being regarded with a level of attention that hadn't been afforded to him moments earlier. What struck me most was how little Aaron himself changed in that moment. He didn't straighten his posture or alter his tone to match the shift in the room. He didn't perform confidence in a way that signaled, "Now you should respect me." He remained steady, answering questions with the same openness and humility he had shown all evening. The transformation happened entirely around him. The room recalibrated its narrative, scrambling to make sense of a version of him that didn't fit the assumptions it had been operating under. Watching that recalibration unfold was both satisfying and unsettling. There was a part of me that felt a quiet sense of validation, not because he needed to prove his worth, but because the people who had been so quick to judge were now forced to confront the limits of their own perspective. At the same time, it was disheartening to realize how conditional their respect was. The respect didn't emerge because they recognized his character. It emerged because they recognized his credentials. That distinction mattered. It highlighted how easily dignity can be granted or withheld based on information that aligns with existing hierarchies. The collapse of their assumptions revealed how fragile those assumptions had been. They hadn't been rooted in knowing him at all. They had been rooted in a story they had constructed based on what he didn't display. When that story unraveled, it didn't just change how they saw him. It exposed how quickly they were willing to rewrite their opinions to align with a narrative of success they could recognize. That exposure carried a quiet kind of accountability. They didn't apologize at that moment. They didn't acknowledge the shift overtly. But the change in how they positioned themselves around him spoke volumes. There was a strange irony in watching people who valued status so highly realize they had misread it. The qualities they had dismissed in him, his humility, his lack of self-promotion, were the very qualities that had obscured the impact of his work from their view. They had assumed that significance must announce itself loudly. The revelation that meaningful work could be carried quietly unsettled their framework for assessing worth. That discomfort rippled through the room in subtle ways, in the way conversations stalled for a second before resuming, in the way some guests seemed to reconsider their earlier laughter. For me, the moment was less about vindication and more about clarity. It clarified the difference between how I saw Aaron and how my family saw him. I had never needed him to fit their definition of success to value him. Their sudden shift in tone didn't change who he was. It only revealed how shallow their earlier judgments had been. That clarity reinforced my decision to choose a partner whose worth didn't hinge on external validation. The truth that flipped the room didn't just elevate Aaron in their eyes. It lowered the credibility of their earlier mockery. The jokes and comments that had seemed casual minutes before now appeared hollow, built on assumptions that couldn't withstand even minimal scrutiny. That hollowing out was the quiet revenge in itself. No confrontation was needed. The narrative they had created collapsed under the weight of reality, leaving them to sit with the dissonance between how they had spoken and what they now knew. What stayed with me from that moment was the awareness of how easily people recalibrate their behavior when their social maps are disrupted. The room didn't suddenly become kinder. I became more cautious. The shift wasn't rooted in newfound empathy. It was rooted in a recognition that they had misjudged someone whose standing now required reconsideration. That realization carried its own lesson for me about the nature of respect in spaces governed by hierarchy, how quickly it can be extended or withdrawn based on perceived status rather than on genuine understanding. The quiet revenge in what unfolded that night didn't come from confrontation or from forcing anyone to acknowledge how wrong they had been. It came from watching the assumptions that had fueled the mockery lose their grip on the room without a single raised voice. There is a particular power in letting reality do the work that arguments rarely accomplish. When people build their judgments on incomplete stories, the truth doesn't need to announce itself loudly to dismantle them. It only needs to be present. What stayed with me after the reception wasn't the satisfaction of seeing my family recalibrate their behavior. It was the deeper understanding of how little their approval actually mattered to the foundation of my happiness. For so long, I had carried the weight of wanting my choices to be validated by the people who raised me. Their acceptance had felt like a stamp of legitimacy on my life decisions. Watching them shift their tone toward Aaron based on information they deemed impressive made it clear how conditional that acceptance had always been. That realization loosened something in me. It freed me from the reflex to seek their approval as a measure of whether I had chosen well. There's a subtle but profound difference between wanting your loved ones to understand your choices and needing their validation in order to feel secure in them. That night helped me see how often I had blurred that line. I wanted my family to see Aaron the way I did, to recognize the qualities I valued in him. But their sudden respect, triggered by learning details that fit their framework of success, showed me that their understanding was filtered through criteria I no longer wanted to live by. I didn't need them to approve of my marriage in order to trust it. The dignity Aaron carried through the evening stayed with me long after the guests had gone home. He didn't change himself to meet the room's expectations. He didn't shrink in response to their mockery, and he didn't inflate himself when their tone shifted. His steadiness offered a model of self-worth that wasn't reactive. Watching that steadiness in contrast to my family's shifting behavior clarified the kind of relational space I wanted to inhabit moving forward. I wanted to build a life where worth wasn't something that rose and fell based on how impressive someone appeared to others. The quiet revenge was also in choosing not to relive the moment in ways that centered their behavior. I didn't need to replay their comments or imagine alternate responses where I defended him more forcefully. The truth had already done what it needed to do. The narrative they had constructed about him had collapsed, and with it, the authority of their mockery. Carrying that knowledge forward felt more grounding than carrying the memory of their disrespect. There was a sense of closure in recognizing that I no longer had to negotiate my happiness through their lens. Their judgments had once felt like something I needed to manage, to anticipate, to soften. That night, I saw how unnecessary that emotional labor had been. Their perspectives shifted not because I explained myself better, but because their assumptions were disrupted. That disruption didn't require my participation. It simply happened. Choosing to let that be enough was its own form of empowerment. It meant I could move forward without needing to extract apologies or acknowledgments that might never come. I could hold my family accountable internally by adjusting how much weight I gave their opinions. That adjustment didn't mean cutting them out of my life. It meant recalibrating the influence they had over how I evaluated my own choices. As I stepped into the next chapter of my life with Aaron, the memory of that night became less about the sting of being mocked and more about the clarity that followed. It clarified what kind of partnership I had chosen, what kind of values I wanted to center, and what kind of respect I expected in the spaces I allowed myself to inhabit. That clarity wasn't dramatic. It was steady, grounding, and quietly liberating.